Good morning. Welcome to Bloomberg UK, a new show with a special focus on the biggest challenges facing the British government, economy, financial services and markets. I'm Tom Mackenzie in London. On the show this week, the British government is assessing the long-term possibility of sending combat aircraft to support Ukraine in the war against Russia. It follows President Zelensky's surprise visit to the UK. He is now in Brussels. We'll discuss with former UK Foreign and Defence Secretary Philip Hammond, who was also Chancellor of the Exchequer under Prime Minister Theresa May. Plus, we'll have more of our interview with the CEO of FTSE 100 consumer goods giant Unilever after the company reported its weakest operating margin in at least 7 years. Now, the British government is weighing sending fighter jets to Ukraine to help in the war against Russia. It follows yesterday's surprise visit by Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to London and Paris, where he did, of course, appeal for more weapons. He's in Brussels today, right now, meeting with lawmakers, of course, and is expected to press those demands in Europe. We are now joined by former UK Chancellor of the Exchequer and former Foreign Secretary as well, Philip Hammond. Thank you very much for joining us in the studio. Really appreciate your time. Let's start there then. It was a bit of a surprise for many watching this when the Prime Minister came out and suggested that fighter planes could be part of the mix going forward. Didn't set a time frame, didn't commit fully to it. Would you support that kind of commitment?
Well, I think we need to do everything we can that's sensible to help the Ukrainians in their battle against Russian aggression. Obviously, the UK led the way in breaking the deadlock on supply of tanks and heavy armour. It was always obvious that the Ukrainians were going to ask for fighter jets next, and I have no doubt that Mr. Zelensky has a plan for the next ask if he gets his fighter jets. The problem with fighter jets is that you can't just send somebody a bunch of Typhoon Eurofighters and the next day they're flying them. It takes years to train a fighter pilot to use these very complex pieces of equipment effectively, which is why the strategy up to now has been to try and find MiG fighters that are available from other Western allies that have old Russian equipment that the Ukrainians are familiar with and can fly pretty much straight away. So I think this will be a much more complex challenge, both in technical terms and in political terms. And I don't expect that we're going to see the Ukrainians flying Western jet fighters within the next period of months. And I think the next 6 months is going to be the critical period for determining where this campaign goes. OK, so it's the headline-grabbing line of it, but it's the complexities around actually operating these vehicles. Lizzie Burden, our UK correspondent, I should say, is joining us in studio. Very pleased to say. Lizzie, you, of course, got the finger on the pulse of the politics of all of this. And there's a sense, there's a concern in the US, certainly, that many, at least some Republicans, are maybe edging away from support Ukraine. Are you seeing similar dynamics here? How unified is the body politic of the UK? And I guess, well, you know, what is your question to the former Chancellor around where we move from here?
Yes, I would say that yesterday it was crucial for Rishi Sunak to remain on the front foot, especially because Boris Johnson is so adored in Ukraine and he was supporting President Zelensky's call for fighter jets. So it was somewhat disappointing for Rishi Sunak to appear a little caught out by that request yesterday, even though Britain had rolled out the red carpet for President Zelensky. I wanted to ask you, Lord Hammond, you are a former Defence Secretary, as Tom mentioned. There have been criticisms that Britain now is overstretched or even defenceless, partly as a result of the cuts to personnel that you made when you were Defence Secretary. Given the security landscape now, do you regret that? No, I don't. No, the pattern of the challenge is changing all the time, and the decision was made a long time ago that we needed, as we drew back from campaigns in places like Afghanistan, which were very, very manpower intensive because of the way we rotated troops into the theatre for 6 months at a time, that we would need less manpower and we needed to focus our defence effort on more sophisticated responses to modern threats. The use of unmanned aerial systems, drones, the space domain, which is an entirely new military domain, and focusing on our intelligence, surveillance, target acquisition, reconnaissance capabilities. This is where modern warfare is won or lost.
Former Chancellor Philip Hammond, what do you make of the fact that there was this nod to Boris Johnson, as Lizzie said, and it's a reminder that the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, has 3 former Prime Ministers behind him as he tries to push through these very difficult policies at a challenging time, of course, for the UK government and the economy. What is your message to the Liz Trusses of the world, the Theresa Mays of the world, and, of course, the Boris Johnsons of the world? Do they need to keep quiet and let the Prime Minister get on with the job?
Yes, I think they do. They need to give him some space because the country's been through a pretty turbulent period, starting with the referendum in 2016, the uncertainty of the Brexit issue for 3 years or more, then COVID, then the political traumas of last year. What we now need is a period of stable, quiet, serious government. And I think Rishi Sunak and his team is in a position to deliver that. They've made a good start. They've dealt with the chaos of last September, October, and we pulled back from the abyss that we were staring into then. What they now need to do is set out a medium-term growth agenda, because it's one thing to have saved the economy from crashing over the cliff, but it's quite another to say to people, but the price we pay is a future of perpetual low or zero growth. People want to hear that there is a brighter future, that this period of inflation pressure on their living standards, of suppressed wage rises, this period will end, and that we will move into a period of economic growth and rising living standards, that we get back to something like normal. And I think if the government can show that it has a plan to do that, it's back in the fight with a chance.
Well, Liz Truss says that she wants to lead the intellectual argument for growth. Is she really the right face to make that argument?
No, I don't think she is. But having said that, I didn't agree with any of Liz Truss's proposed solutions, but I think she identified the problem, that we've spent far too long in this country arguing about how to cut the cake up and not enough time worrying about how to grow the cake. And it doesn't matter which side of the political divide you're on, Labour or Conservative, ultimately, an argument about dividing the cake is ultimately futile. It has to be about making the cake bigger.
And in an op-ed for The Telegraph over the weekend, she essentially blamed her downfall on the volatility in the pension market. Is that a fair assessment? No,
I don't think so. I think the idea that you can create stability by borrowing for tax cuts is for the birds. You know, it's an idea that has been kicking around on both left and right. You know, the left would have, John McDonnell, he was my shadow when I was Chancellor, would have borrowed huge amounts of money in order to spend more. Liz Truss proposed to borrow huge amounts of money in order to cut taxes. Neither of those strategies is sustainable. In the real world, you have to do the hard work first. You have to grow your economy first. Then you can decide, do I want to cut taxes or do I want to increase public spending? We will have an argument about that, but that's a high-class problem to have, being in a position to have that argument.
You talk about the need for a growth plan, and that is acute, isn't it? And I wonder, you look at the mix when it comes to planning, when it comes to immigration, when it comes to dealing with the NHS, and you just wonder if the Conservative Party in its current form is structurally unable to address those levers that could be pulled to grow this economy.
And you've hit the nail on the head. That is the structural challenge to the Tory party. If the Tory party is going to be electorally successful, it has to be the party of economic growth. And to grow the economy right now, the government needs to address the sclerotic planning system, planning and development. It needs to deal with the chronic shortage of labour, particularly lower skilled labour now is the big immediate problem. That means relaxing the immigration system. And we need to repair our relationships with our biggest trading partner. Now, all three of those things run into significant opposition in the Tory grassroots. And the government has got to show that it can craft a narrative which persuades those Tory grassroots that this agenda can be embraced. Because without growth, without a growth agenda, we are going nowhere as a party and nowhere as a nation.
And of course, what's also holding back growth are the strikes across sectors, and they're spreading. As we look ahead to the March budget, should the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, be loosening the purse strings and giving more to the striking workers?
No, he shouldn't. And I'm afraid the government does have to set the tone here. Look, this is a very difficult period for British people, British consumers, British workers. But the truth is, we have got poorer. We've got poorer because of Brexit, we've got poorer because of COVID, we've got poorer because of the changed energy economy in the world, higher price of the energy we consume. And that has to be reflected in reduced living standards. And the transmission mechanism for those external shocks into the domestic economy is inflation. And anyone who thinks that they can just go to their employer, public or private sector, and demand a pay increase which matches inflation is not understanding the facts of our economy. We are going to be a bit poorer. We just have to dust ourselves down, get back to the treadmill and make sure that we grow the economy over the coming years in order to get our living standards back to where they were and then onward to keep up with our neighbours in Europe.
You accept that's a really difficult message to take if you're a civil servant, if you're a firefighter, if you're a nurse on the front lines, and they're asking for, what, 10% now? There is no evidence, really, of a wage price spiral that we're seeing here in the UK. Not yet.
Not yet. But if the government starts to concede inflation-matching pay increases in the public sector, then there will be a wage price spiral.
Before we let you go, the priorities for the March budget.
Well, I think it's exactly that. The Chancellor has done a great job at stabilising the ship, but now he's got to show that he's more than just a stabiliser. He's a visionary with a growth plan for the future.
No tax cuts?
No, tax cuts should not be the priority at the moment. It's about a credible plan for growth over the next 2-3 years.
OK. Lord Hammond, thank you very much for your time. Former Chancellor, of course, Philip Hammond. Bloomberg's Lizzie Burden, of course, our UK correspondent. Let's bring you back the live pictures. We're going to get them shortly of President Zelensky in Brussels. We know he's at the European Parliament. He's going to be making a speech, of course, after the surprise visit to the UK. It really electrified lawmakers, of course, in Westminster yesterday, that speech, and then the surprise visit to Paris. We're now seeing lawmakers in the European Parliament awaiting that speech then from the Ukrainian president. Of course, top of the list in terms of his asks are expected to be further concrete support from his European allies in terms of military hardware. Interesting that the Prime Minister of the UK suggested that possibly at some point fighter jets could be provided to Ukraine, with important caveats. Coming up, Unilever says we are probably now past peak inflation, but we are not yet at peak prices. We're going to hear from the CEO of the consumer goods giant next. This is Bloomberg.
There is more input cost pressure coming through into our business. In fact, we're calling out this morning that we see another €1.5 billion of input cost inflation in the first half of 2023. And so the way I would characterize it is that we are now probably past peak inflation, but we're not yet at peak prices. There is still more pricing to come through. And as I say, we work very hard to make sure that pricing is the last tool that we move to take advantage of and not the first tool.
And you mentioned prices not past peak, but we heard from Tesco Chairman John Allen, who said that he believes food suppliers like Unilever and others are increasing prices maybe faster than they need to be. Do you agree with that? I mean, how are communications between companies like Tesco considering the pressures that you're facing?
Yeah, I kind of already gave the answer to that, which is that we only actually passed through 75% of the cost input pressures that we felt. Our shareholders absorbed some of the input cost pressure by accepting a reduction in Unilever's margin. And I think our retail partners should be reassured that the conversations and negotiations we have with them are sufficiently robust. There's no chance we would be able to put through pricing that was running ahead of our cost inputs.
Unilever CEO Alan Jope speaking to Bloomberg's Jennifer Zabasajat there. Really important conversation, Jen. What stood out for you? What are the implications around pricing for the broader UK economy?
Yeah, Tom, I think what was interesting, I mean, Alan said shareholders should be reassured, but the interesting thing will be whether or not the UK consumers will be reassured, right? Especially when you consider him saying that prices are likely to go up. But in terms of investors at this point in time, they're somewhat reassured by these results. But what we're seeing from UK consumers at this point in time is that discounted retailers are really doing a lot better right now. So that could be potentially a concern for a company like Unilever if consumers start to drift away from some of their products like Dove, like Hellmann's mayonnaise, and opt for something a little bit more cheaper, considering all the inflationary pressure that they're already facing.
It's such a difficult needle to thread, isn't it? Ensuring that they maintain margins whilst not driving customers to the likes of Aldi and Lidl and others lower cost products. Thank you, Jen. Really important conversation with the CEO of Unilever. Coming up, Bailey in Parliament, the Bank of England governor, appears before the Treasury Select Committee to discuss the latest interest rate decision and the ongoing inflation battle. We discuss the latest on the UK economy next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back. Economics, finance, politics. This is Bloomberg UK. I'm Tom Mackenzie in London. Now, Bank of England Governor Andrew Bailey is in Parliament this morning. He's appearing before the Treasury Select Committee, where members are questioning him on the central bank's battle against inflation and the outlook for the British economy. For more, we're joined by Bloomberg senior UK economist Dan Hanson. Dan, what are you going to be tuning in for, zeroing in on when it comes to the comments and the grilling of Bailey at this committee?
Yeah, so I think for us it's going to be... We saw last week that the bank kind of opened the door to a pause in that rate hiking cycle. It indicated that it was getting very close to the peak in rates. And I think what we've got on at the TSC today, you've got Bailey and Pill, who are the probably in the centre of the committee. You've got Temreiro, who's on the dovish side, and you've got Haskell, who's probably on the more hawkish side. So I think for us it's going to be listening to the comments and see how the centre of gravity is shifting, and whether, the March decision appears to be on a knife edge at the moment, and it's whether we think, there's this sort of push towards another hike, probably a smaller hike, but is there going to be this push towards another hike in March?
So we have the live pictures now from the committee hearing. We don't see Andrew Bailey. He's in the room, of course, alongside his colleagues, and we may bring sound of that if we hear something that is worth bringing to your attention. So Andrew Bailey, of course, testifying, or at least getting some questions in that Treasury Select Committee. So you talk about the importance of focusing on the next meeting in March, but also, and this is what you nod to, is the state of the divisions within the Bank of England's MPC, and you contrast that with the Fed. They're in a slightly similar position in terms of the divisions versus the ECB, for example. The data is going to inform how this plays out across doves and hawks and those in the centre. What is the data that you and the team are looking for that will be consequential for that March meeting?
So I think, you just have to go straight to the guidance that the bank issued last week. So they're looking at three things. It's the tightness of the labour market, very similar to the Fed, wage growth, very similar to the Fed, and also services inflation. And we've got two labour market reports and we've got two CPI reports coming before the March meeting. And the other thing I'd just add in there is we've got the March budget as well, which is the wild card here. But in terms of the data, I think what the committee will want to see to justify another hike is services and wage growth beating their forecasts. And I think there probably is enough in the data, for us at least, to push them towards one more hike. We think they'll probably be a little bit surprised, particularly on services inflation. So I think we're going to get one more hike in March. But after that, we think they're going to pause, because they're very aware of the impact that what they've done already, the impact that's going to have on the economy. And there is, of course, in the UK, this huge real income squeeze as well, and that is going to do some of the work in slowing demand.
Okay, so services is really key. That's likely to push them to another hike, and of course, the damage and that 6-month time frame in terms of the real impact of these rate hikes, as most economists forecast. In terms of where things evolve on the rate front, then some in the market still pricing in a cut by the end of this year. Is that a view held by you and the team? Yeah,
that one's really interesting, and I think it's gained a bit more traction given the arguably quite dovish tilt we saw last week. For us, the answer's no for this year, purely because of the state of the labour market. We think it's going to take quite a long time for the labour market to cool, and the committee's not going to be willing to take its foot off the brake before next year, when we think inflation will drop quite sharply. We'll get some quite favourable base effects. But the thing to remember in the UK is that we've got, as I say, a very tight labour market, but it's a function of two things. It's not just labour demand, it's labour supply as well, and it's very well documented about the increase in retirees, long-term sickness in the UK, and that means it's just going to take a long time for that unemployment rate to rise, and for the committee to be confident that wage growth isn't going to be at a level that just is nowhere near consistent with its 2% inflation target.
Dan Hanson, with the granularity and the context around what's happening with the BOE, as Andrew Bailey, of course, the governor, sits there in the Treasury Select Committee taking questions, and of course we'll keep you across that story. Dan Hanson's line is focus on wage growth, focus on services in terms of how it informs the March decision from the BOE. Dan Hanson, thank you very much indeed. Now, be sure to subscribe to Bloomberg's In the City podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. New episodes drop every Thursday. Now, our colleagues at Bloomberg Radio here in London have a new podcast as well, which you can download every weekday morning. It is your essential business news briefing in just 15 minutes. Bloomberg Radio anchor Stephen Carroll joins me now. Stephen, what can listeners get with this podcast? Congratulations on the launch, by the way. Why should people be downloading it and tuning in?
Thanks, Tom. It's called Bloomberg Daybreak Europe Edition. And look, it's the best of Bloomberg. It's everything you need to know about what's happening in the world in terms of global news stories, the top business headlines, what's moving markets. We pick through the UK newspapers every morning as well for the best business news stories to give you a bit of a flavour of what else is out there in the world. And we bring you the best of Bloomberg's 2,700 journalists and analysts from around the world. This morning, for example, Francine Lacqua was with us talking us through those Credit Suisse results. Earlier in the week, we had our interview with Danny Blanchflower, the former MPC member, talking about where he thinks the UK economy is going next and, crucially, what he thinks the Bank of England should do now as well. It's just 15 minutes. It sets you up for your day. We have it in your podcast feeds by 7 a.m. every morning. It is the Bloomberg Daybreak Europe Edition podcast, the best of what we do on Bloomberg Radio here in London. If I borrow an expression, Tom, from radio history, I'd say if you give us 15 minutes, we'll give you the world.
Sterling job there, Stephen Carroll, on selling this podcast. Download it. It is excellent. If you're time-starved, there it is. 15 minutes, sets you up for the day. Bloomberg Radio's Stephen Carroll on that new podcast. Thank you very much indeed. You can, of course, listen to Stephen's podcast, Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, every weekday, available from 7 a.m. London time. Download it on Apple, Spotify, or at Bloomberg.com. We continue, of course, to keep across the news when it comes to the Ukraine president and his visit to the European Parliament. He's due to speak there any moment. Lawmakers are awaiting that speech from the Ukrainian president after the surprise visit to London and then Paris. Of course, the demand will be additional support from EU lawmakers in terms of military hardware in that conflict with Russia, as the potential additional push from Russia is lined up for April. That is the concern. We'll keep across that story for you. Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition is next. Stay with us. This is Bloomberg.